some basic chemical terms. We've examined how chemical reactions occur and the importance of pH to living things. We turn now to the complex chemicals of life itself. The carbon atom is essential to most of these chemicals. Because it has 4 electrons in its outer shell, it can form covalent bonds with itself and with other elements. This makes possible so many compounds that an entire branch of chemistry, organic chemistry, is devoted to the study of carbon and carbon compounds. Carbon forms the basis of 4 major types of biological molecules: carbohydrates, lipids, proteins, and nucleic acids. Let's talk about carbohydrates first. Carbohydrates are the most abundant biological molecules. They contain carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen, usually in a ratio of 1 to 2 to 1. Many of the foods you eat are made of carbohydrates. Bread, pasta, fruits, and most vegetables are all sources of carbohydrates. The most basic carbohydrate is the sugar glucose. Glucose has the formula C6H12O6 and occurs in a variety of different shapes. Glucose is a simple sugar, or monosaccharide. Monosaccharides are the building blocks for a number of more complex carbohydrates. They are also the base of the cellular energy chain. In the presence of oxygen, they can break apart to yield carbon dioxide, water, and a considerable amount of energy. When 2 monosaccharides are joined, they form a 2-sugar unit called a disaccharide. The reaction, called a condensation reaction or dehydration reaction, also gives off a molecule of water. Adding more monosaccharides yields a polysaccharide. Each time a monosaccharide is added, a water molecule is released. Carbohydrates have several functions. They can store energy. Plants, like potatoes, store energy in the form of starch, long branching chains of glucose units linked together. Vertebrates store energy in the form of glycogen, also long branching chains of glucose units. Before either starch or glycogen can be used, it must be broken down into glucose. Just as water was released when polysaccharides were formed, it must now be added to break them apart and free the individual glucose molecules. This reaction is called hydrolysis. Digestion is the most common example of hydrolysis. Carbohydrates also have structural functions. The main structural carbohydrate of plants is cellulose. A molecule of cellulose is formed from about 3,000 glucose units. However, it cannot be broken down into glucose units as easily as starch and glycogen. The exoskeletons of arthropods, such as crabs, lobsters, and scorpions, are made up of another structural carbohydrate called chitin. Chitin is chains of glucose to which nitrogen groups are added. The second biologically important class of compounds is the lipids. Lipids are insoluble in water and other polar substances. That's why this oil floats to the top of the salad dressing. The basis of the structure of most lipids is the fatty acid, a chain of carbon atoms held together by covalent bonds. Those fatty acids having all single covalent bonds are called saturated fatty acids. Other fatty acids contain double covalent bonds and are called unsaturated fatty acids. These unsaturated fats are more reactive, so they break down more easily. In contrast, saturated fats are less reactive and tend to deposit in the arteries. Animals, such as these polar bears, store lipids as fat. While the energy in lipids is not as readily available as the energy in carbohydrates, lipids are able to concentrate much higher amounts. Fat contains twice the energy of the same amount of carbohydrate. During the harsh winter months, when food is scarce, these bears' bodies break down the fat and use the stored energy. Stored lipids are broken down only after an organism has used all its starch and glycogen. Plants also have a lipid energy storage system. They convert excess starch to oils. Some seeds, such as peanuts, yield large quantities of oil when pressed. These oil reserves provide energy to the emerging seedling until it can make its own food. Lipids also have a variety of structural functions. They may serve as insulation, allowing animals such as seals to live in areas of extreme cold, and protecting the internal organs of animals like the camel from the intense heat of the tropical sun. The camel's hump is a large reservoir of fat, not a storage site for water. Lipids may provide padding for vital tissues and organs. Our kidneys are embedded in a thick layer of fat which protects them from sharp blows and damaging jarring. Thick layers of wax form a protective coating on the outer surface of many leaves, protecting them from water loss. The third major class of biological molecules is proteins. Proteins have many functions. There are structural proteins in skin, hair, and nails. Proteins serve as stored food in eggs and seeds. Still others function as enzymes, hormones, hemoglobin, and antibodies. It's easy to see why we're so dependent on proteins. 20 amino acids are used to build proteins in living organisms. They may be as simple as glycine, whose R group is simply a hydrogen atom, or as complicated as arginine. In living cells, amino acids are joined together by a type of covalent bond called a peptide bond to form proteins or polypeptides. The reaction of two amino acids takes place in the area between the NH2 region of one acid and the COOH region of another. It is a condensation reaction, so a molecule of water is released. Proteins have the ability to assume different shapes or structures. These shapes are important in order for the protein to function properly. A specific shape enables a specific function. Another important group of biological molecules are the nucleic acids. These are named because they were first observed as stained material within the nuclei of cells. One type of nucleic acid, DNA, occurs in the nucleus of the vast majority of living organisms. Each DNA unit is composed of the 5-carbon sugar deoxyribose, a phosphate group, and one of 4 nitrogenous bases, either thymine, cytosine, adenine, or guanine. Long chains of these units, called nucleotides, bond together to form DNA. 2 strands are twisted by hydrogen bonds into a molecule that looks like a spiral staircase. The exact sequence of the 4 bases forms the genetic code which determines the characteristics of all living organisms. A second type of nucleic acid, RNA, is a single-stranded molecule. It's also made up of a sugar, a phosphate group, and a base. However, in RNA, the sugar is ribose, not deoxyribose, and the base uracil replaces thymine. RNA occurs in cells in several forms that carry out the instructions of the genetic code. Life on Earth ranges from the tiny to the huge, from the ridiculous to the sublime. To understand its many forms and functions, we have to explore beyond what we can see and hear to develop an understanding of the basic chemical reactions that underlie all of life's processes.